Okay, let's um, let's get down to brass tacks, as they say. So far, we've done. You should have watched the Agile Kool-Aid talk and talked about some of the philosophy of Agile and so forth. But let's talk about a specific process methodology and its specific mechanisms. Um, if it wasn't clear from the Kool-Aid talk, Agile is again a philosophy, a culture, if you will, of developing software. It doesn't refer to a specific process method. Within the Agile umbrella, there's several of them: Crystal, Extreme Programming, and Scrum. And Scrum is, I think, pretty much the most popular flavor now of an Agile methodology for particular reasons. And it's the one we're going to use in this class. So I want to kind of do a little bit more of a how-to. I want to get down to brass tacks, give you some specific things that go on in a scrum, and also point out those things that I expect you to do. Several of these things, most of these things, are things you are specifically going to do in the context of your class project. To start off with, this is the and it's not focused very well, but this is the classic Scrum diagram. You can Google this one up. You see it everywhere, and it's trying to explain a number of items in context for you. The notions of product backlogs, sprint backlogs, the nature of how often you meet, what happens in a daily stand-up that you see up over here. This is the product backlog, sprint backlog, the nature of a sprint as you see it going around, and the nature of the turnaround every day as it goes around. And then the important part that we noticed that we discussed in our philosophy was delivering working software at the end of every sprint. So I'm going to walk through each of those and then kind of come back to this diagram periodically to because this kind of captures the whole metaphor. But I want to talk about each one of these areas, particular, so you understand how to start executing a Scrum. Um, First, a who's who. So I always like to start off with people. Who's involved in the Scrum because again, a traditional team might, particularly a software engineering team, might be composed of, your project manager, your business analyst, your QA resource or tester, operations support, and of course the software engineers. And you might have a software architect, you might have a tech lead, you might have a DBA, you might have a user experience experts, and your rank and file developers, if you will. Scrum's approach is not as role specific and functional specific. It's not that those people go away, but those kinds of labels aren't really talked about. You're really looking for a team that is going to commit to getting something done together with their customer, and from that perspective, they will have, there are a set of roles that folks will do in a team, but not in those traditional mechanisms. Well, let me explain. So the first who's who, the first role we are concerned with is a Scrum Master, and you can get certified as a Scrum Master. The Scrum Master is it's not the traditional project manager. I mean, a lot of project managers have gotten retrained as Scrum Masters, of course, but it's not the traditional project manager in terms of that project manager going around and being a taskmaster. So we talked about predictive process models in the Kool-Aid talk, and we talked about that task activity network, looking at the project plan and saying you're doing this, you're doing that, and if the project manager needs to reassign a task and move this over here and so forth. That's not really how Scrum works, or what a Scrum Master does. The Scrum Master is responsible for a few things, though. They are responsible for enforcing the Scrum rules. There are a few rules to Scrum that will pick up, how we conduct a daily stand-up, when the spike, conducting a retrospective, and so forth. Not really a rule-centric type mentality, not very restrictive process, but there are some rules to the game, if you will, and it's the Scrum Master's responsibility to make sure that they're being followed. It is the Scrum Master's responsibility to be kind of an observer and to gauge the team's progress and to raise the risk to outside management and to customers if something isn't going well, or raise it back to the team and suggest actions, if you will. The Scrum Master will make immediate decisions in the face of uncertain or incomplete information. What does that mean? I'm pausing because, if you've worked on teams enough, you may have gotten into a situation, or maybe individually, where you got paralyzed, where you got kind of stuck and you didn't know what to do. Or perhaps you were doing what's called thrashing. You work on something and you're concentrating on your work and you get stuck on it. And you keep going back and forth and you can't seem to get out of this cycle. Happens a lot in software development. It's extremely important. We talked about it again in the Kool-Aid talk as well, of this consistent pace at which teams work. Well, if you're getting stuck on something and you can't move forward, and the team can't move forward, perhaps then that's the antithesis of agility. Being able to maintain your velocity is extremely important, to not just have a standstill state. So if there is something that the team needs as a decision and can't get it, maybe that customer has disappeared, or product owner that we talked about, because they're not really present every day like pure agile philosophy wants them to be. Or maybe there's a hold on a server you're trying to get, so whatever, and the team can't be sure how to move forward, and the team's discussing it, and the team can't decide. I mean, normally the entire team tries to work something out first. Think of the Scrum Master as almost like the vice president in the Senate. They get to cast a vote in the case of a tie. They are going to make that immediate decision to make sure the team can maintain its consistent rate of progress, its velocity, because standing still is worse than doing an action in the wrong direction. Okay, so that's what that last one means. But the main thing, and I kind of saved this for last, is the Scrum Master is responsible for removing impediments. So Scrum Master is considered more of a facilitator than a traditional project master. We'll talk about the daily stand-up. Team members individually and as a team as a whole will identify obstacles, things getting in their way, and it's a Scrum Master's job to work with the team member, or perhaps for the team member, to remove that impediment. Something outside's going on. Some outside boss is coming in and bugging you, wanting you to go to some offsite, but yet you got to finish the sprint, and that conflict can't be resolved. It is a Scrum Master's job to go forward and try and remove that impediment. Can't get the server installed. The Scrum Master, that's the kind of item that will get assigned to the Scrum Master. I've got to go work with the operations group, figure out what the heck is going on, get a resolution to this so the team can maintain its velocity. That's kind of the key thing that a Scrum Master does. Product owner is responsible for the product. Should be outside the team. Again, normally Pure Agile says we want the customer on the team. In reality, the customer living amongst you is, for practical reasons, can't happen that often. So normally you have some kind of account manager, product manager, somebody who's a product owner that kind of speaks for the customer to be able to make those customer-facing decisions, particularly those things on the product backlog and in terms of priorities of work. Whenever the team gets in a situation of, in the next working, potentially shippable increment, we could deliver this or that. Who gets to really decide that? Well, the product owner does. When you sit down to prioritize work for the next sprint, who gets to do the priorities from the business side? Well, if you have the customer, great. If not, then the product owner internally in the organization that speaks for the customer gets that task. Could be a manager from somewhere, could be sales. The key thing is to realize it's not just somebody else on the team. All right, the product owner is not somebody who's a development resource or an engineer on the team. All right. The product owner has high visibility. You should know who that person is. It should be a person, not a group of people. If you can, it should be someone who's accessible to the team, and it should somebody you try and be consistent. You don't want to be swapping out product owners all the time. Usually you have a consistent Scrum Master as well, but even in some organizations I've seen Scrum Masters have been rotated out after a few, certain number of sprints. And in your projects, you're each going to take a turn being a Scrum Master and running one of the Scrums on your team. I don't know if you can see the cartoon very well. This is kind of the classic cartoon. On a development team, as I said, instead of talking in terms of BA this, DBA that, operations person, and so forth, the roles are chickens and pigs. And you should always know whether you're a chicken or you're a pig. And why do they call them chicken and pigs? Well, in case you can't read the cartoon there, what it basically is the chicken goes to the pig and says, "Hey, I think we should open a restaurant." And the pig goes, "Well, okay, well, but what will we call it?" And the chicken says, "Hey, how about ham and eggs?" And the pig thinks for a minute and kind of says, "Well, no thanks. I'd be committed. You'd only be involved." Why do we use that joke in Agile? Congratulations on your project teams, you're pigs. You write the code. You are committed to the project. You are committed to project success. Chickens are stakeholders. They are certainly invested. They certainly want the project to be successful, but they aren't the ones making it happen. In an organization, a stakeholder might be a salesperson who's looking to sell the product when it comes out. It could be a support person or a support manager who knows that once the product, this next increment is shipped, that their organization will have to perform client support. Any number of folks like that. But it's the chickens, the pigs actually kind of rule over the chickens in the sense of, since the pigs are responsible for delivering the product, they get a priority over how the project is conducted and what you actually do. And we'll see when we talk about Scrum boards and so forth, you'll see very specific manifestations of that. So chickens and pigs, we will talk about that the rest of the time. Let me see here. Our cartoon seems to be reformatted. Okay, fix that, sorry. First important concept, and again, going back up to our master Scrum diagram, if you will, our product backlog here is what we're going to talk about first. The product backlog: prioritize product features desired by the customer. These boxes in this factory model, if you will, those boxes represent the features that the customer wants, and those features are prioritized, so they're stacked, if you will, in some priority. That's what our backlog represents. All right. So it's a prioritized queue, just like you talked about prioritized queues and data structures. Right. Represents everything that anyone interested in a project or process has thought is needed or would be a good idea in the product. So in classic requirements engineering, what you normally do is you try and define an initial scope. When I teach that class, I talk about kind of building a fence around the product that represents the scope, and you can decide all the things that belong in the product and things that you can immediately decide are not appropriate for the product. Agile requirements engineering with a product backlog works a little bit differently. Essentially, you have this endless queue of stuff that could go on an infinite timeline for product releases. And as long as it's prioritized, we're only going to worry about what is currently the most important and valuable things to the customer at any given point in time. So as long as that thing is prioritized, it can be as big and we can put anything on it we want. Things that tend not to be useful, that have been on the product backlog for too long a time, and it's never made it up to the top of the list. Think of the stack of papers on your desk representing work, and something never gets to the top. What eventually happens? Well, normally you find out you kind of don't need it anymore and you discard it. So things that are in the product backlog that never seem to make it into active work for the team, they kind of just fall away over time. As long as the product exists, the product backlog exists. Again, it is dynamic and sorted by priority at all times. Remember we said the product owner owns the product backlog, right? It says it right there. The product owner owns it, and at any time the product owner can reorganize the priorities of the product backlog items at any time. There'll be one caveat to that when we talk about what goes on the sprint backlog, but when I look at this set of work represented here, I can restack those boxes at any time. Those boxes are in the back waiting to be put on a different backlog we'll talk about in a minute called the sprint backlog. But at any given point in time, the product owner can come along and reorder the boxes. That's what the product owner owns it, so the product owner gets to do that. All right, so from the product backlog, let me stay with that. From the product backlog, we go and move boxes onto the sprint backlog. That sprint backlog means we've selected something and we're going to put it in the things that the team is going to work on. It's on the conveyor belt, if you will. All right. The exercise that we do that in is called a sprint planning session. We'll talk about that. And in that sprint planning session, the fundamental thing is to take the highest priority items that can fit in the context of a sprint. And a sprint is, again, a time box. Here it says 30 days. You're going to do 2 weeks. 2 weeks is somewhat of an industry norm now. Shorter sprints are considered better. But whatever the time, whatever the short iteration is defined to be, and whatever your team's velocity or capacity for doing work is, you grab the appropriate amount of stuff off the product backlog, move it to the sprint backlog, and start to churn through it. Okay? So that's basically a sprint backlog. So a subset of the product backlog assigned to the current sprint. It may include tasks and subtasks identified as needed in the sprint to finish the work. We're going to talk about the concept next week of a user story, and we're going to talk about tasks associated with user stories. But pretty much the sprint backlog and a sprint is supposed to represent all the things that the team needs to do in some short, finite time period. The Scrum team owns the backlog. What that means is once you go through a planning process, which involves a negotiation between the product owner and the team, the Scrum team, and you decide which one of those highest priority items you're going to actually put on the sprint backlog, once you've made that decision, then the sprint is set. And that's the work you're going to do. So the product owner steps away and can't reprioritize that. The product owner can't come into the middle of a sprint and say, "Oh, wait a minute, I want to deprioritize that and I want this other thing in its place." That's not quote unquote allowed, if you will. All right. The entire team owns the backlog as well. The Scrum Master facilitates. Again, there's that word again, but doesn't own the sprint backlog. All right, the entire team owns it. The entire team, this is part of the Agile philosophy again, makes a commitment or an accountability to say we promise that we will put this in the potentially shippable increment of a product for this sprint, and it's the entire team's responsibility. It's not the responsibility of individuals on the team. Even when we get down to the representation of what goes on the backlog, these user stories and tasks that I talk about, even then, even if a task or a user story is assigned to an individual, that individual does not sink or swim by him or herself. The entire team does. And that's a culture you need to do in your projects as well. I see this a lot in my student projects where folks too much don't work as a team, but instead kind of do a divide and conquer, saying, "Oh, well, we put 5 things on the backlog, so let's each take one and we'll be responsible for it. And you know, if yours isn't successful but mine is, I'm still successful but you're not." There is no such concept. I mean, individuals are not successful or not. Teams are. And their success is defined by their ability to deliver the product at the end of a sprint. And that's just the way it is. So it doesn't matter whether you get your task done. The entire team has to commit to getting all the tasks done. And we'll talk about some features that Scrum has that kind of reinforce that culture to it. Excuse me. Okay, conducting sprints. The sprint itself, again, so now we're working our way up this diagram. I keep going back to it. I wonder if I can kind of clear this off for a second. Okay. This is the sprint. this circle. And again, and here it says 30 days because that Schwaber and Beal's book that I talked about, that a lot of folks use as the initial guidance for Scrum, recommended 30 days. But really, it's up to your organization. It's up to your project. I've seen sprints as short as a week. I've seen kind of a norm of 2 weeks. But really, it's a time box that's of short duration, 30 days or less, I would say, but beyond that, there's no dogmatic approach to it. So when we refer to a sprint, we're referring to Agile, Scrum's flavor of an iteration. The sprint term is used to connotate speed. You're working in a short distance, which a sprint is. It's not a marathon, it's a sprint. And you're going as fast as you can, and as fast as can be sustained. Again, that notion of rhythm or cadence to the team. You want to work through your sprint backlog work in a regular, rhythmic kind of conveyor beltish way. Put that conveyor belt, put that treadmill on a certain speed, and be able to operate comfortably at it. All right. That's kind of the notion of that's the metaphor for conducting a sprint. What are they specifically? All right. Short iterations designed to, first, you're going to produce working software at the end of every sprint. Second, empower the development team. What do we mean by that? When the development team takes on the sprint, when the pigs take on the sprint, now the pigs are in charge. They get to decide what tasks they're going to do. They don't have a taskmaster going around saying you have to do this, this, and this. If they're working on something and that's not working and they need to do something else to be successful, they do something else. They collaborate to help each other out. No one tells the engineers, the developers, how to do their job. All right. They are empowered as long as they can maintain their commitment to producing that working software at the end of the sprint. Sprints enable small adjustments without failing the iteration. So we're back to Super Mario. I should have put Super Mario on this slide. Super Mario is making those small adjustments, steering. All right, and it's I like the Super Mario analogy works for me as well, because there's only so long you can play Super Mario before you're eventually going to fall off that bridge, cliff, road, whatever, and lose one of your video game lives, if you will. For a period of short duration, time-boxed working collaboratively in a team, you should be able to react to change. What you're trying to do is not think that change isn't going to happen. You're trying to minimize and manage its impact and expect its impact in the context of that short time box and through ownership of the team in order to make those small adjustments in order to steer without the project failing. All right. The remainder of this slide talks about a sprint mini how-to, and this is really a kind of an outline for the rest of this talk. The intent is this how-to is intended to give you guidance on how you're to conduct your sprints. And by the way, this is how people really conduct sprints when they're doing the Scrum methodology. So I'll talk about each one of these: defining your sprint goal, conducting the planning session, executing the sprint, conducting the sprint review, conducting a retrospective. And along the way, I'll try and give a flavor of what that means in the context of your project. Okay, sprint steps. First one, define a sprint goal. What's a sprint goal? Okay, I'm sorry, I apologize. You could probably notice I pause my recording from time to time. I'm having some slide formatting issues. I developed these on a Mac, and then but this station I sit in front of to do these recordings is a Windows box, and I'm having some formatting issues. Anyway, back to the notion of a sprint goal, our first sprint step. A sprint goal is a declarative statement of the sprint objective. All right, what does declarative mean? Declarative is a definitive statement of something. All right, normally a statement of fact, if you will. And normally you try and phrase it in such a way it has a yes or no to it. So you can ask, hey, did we meet that or not? Technically, according to Scrum, the sprint goal can be met to different degrees, but they're discrete. In other words, the answer to a sprint goal is not we achieved 70% of it, or 59% of it, or 83% of it. It's meant to be, did we, Did we produce working software? Did we complete the user interface? Our sprint goal was completion of the wireframes for user interface in the design sprint, let's say. And the answer is either yes or no. All right, or the answer could be high, medium, or low, is what different degrees means. But different degrees means discrete degrees. And part of the reason why that's important is too often those new to sprint and used to working in that task-driven model again have a tendency to say, well, I'm 70% done because I did 70% of the estimated work or 70% of the estimated tasks. In other words, they're focused on the tasks that were defined in the sprint and not the requirements, not what was supposed to go in the software. The sprint goal should be phrased in terms of what software is to be delivered in the potentially shippable increment due at the end of the sprint, not defined in terms of what work the team is going to do. All right. Now, it's possible that the team achieves a Scrum goal without completing all of the things on the Scrum board. In particular, you can say, yes, we achieved. We have a potentially shippable increment that meets the sprint goal, even though we didn't complete. When we look at our Scrum board, we don't have all the or sprint backlog. We don't have all the tasks done. We may not even have all the requirements done, but the user interface wireframes are done. So we had achieved our sprint goal. Again, the team's in charge. The pigs are in charge. The team's empowered to achieve the sprint goal however they deem best. So they're supposed to be self-organizing, kind of autonomous, if you will. So once they make that agreement during planning, as we'll talk about in a minute, once the sprint's going, they achieve the sprint goal in the way that they, as trained engineers, feel it's best to do it, not how somebody else tells them to do it. All right. And again, collective responsibility of the team to do that. Sprint planning. Sprint planning sessions are attended by the Scrum Master, Scrum team, and any other parties that want to see how the sprint will go. In other words, sprint planning sessions are typically attended by chickens and pigs. All right. These time estimates are, again, kind of from the Schwaber and Beadle. Folks really kind of decide for the size and scope and domain of their projects just how big and long their sprint planning sessions are. And by the way, this is not how long I expect your sprint planning sessions to be by any stretch either. But the recommended practice initially was to have a meeting of roughly half a day where the Scrum team and the Scrum Master select the items from the product backlog that can be implemented in the next 30 days. What that means is when you start the sprint planning session, it's expected that you have the prioritized queue in order. All right, which means basically that the customer has gone through that process and already prioritize the product backlog so that the team can look at the first items on the product backlog and decide which ones they think they should do and how much. Now, in kind of a pure world, the next ones that the Scrum team will do will simply be the next N number that they can get done in that amount of time according to how big the team is and how much work they can get done. However, they do have some flexibility in terms of selecting things from the product backlog, largely because the engineers should understand if there's some kind of natural synergies or even dependencies between some of the user stories that are on the product backlog. So you have a product backlog where some of the items deal with a database, and some of the other items deal with user experience. Some of the other items deal with some kind of application logic. You kind of know where your resources are for that particular sprint or the next few sprints. You also know that you can't build certain screens in the user interface, let's say, until certain database tables are available because they provide the data to fill in the screens. So you may want to do things in order that's slightly different than the business priorities set by the product owner. Okay. We'll talk more about that next week as well when we talk about user stories again, and we'll talk about what really happens in the second half of the meeting, and that is this negotiation that happens. So what basically happens is after that first initial prep work by the team and the team's initial draft of a sprint backlog is the product owner comes back in and says, okay, let me see what you selected and let me negotiate with you. You're saying that you want to do this, this, and this. This is what I originally wanted. Let's come to a common agreement. All right, so there's this convergence of saying, hey, we want this, you're providing that kind of thing, so that the product owner is happy with whatever will be included in the potentially shippable increment, and the Scrum team is comfortable making a promise to deliver it. Okay. Now, this is part, as an aside, this is probably the one part of a student class project that is very difficult to approximate, at least in this particular class, because you don't have individual product owners. I'm not going to be your product owner. You're going to essentially be running sprints, pretending there's a product owner there, setting your priorities. And so this negotiation and this aspect of the sprint planning will not be as explicit to you. I will mention that next year when you do a capstone project, normally we try and have industry sponsors, or at least a faculty sponsor, some kind of outside sponsor playing that role in helping with that negotiation process, because it's a really important part of software development. And I'll say this negotiation isn't necessarily just an agile thing. Although Scrum's made it more explicit, the idea of working with your customer in order to set their expectations on what you can deliver when, that ability to set those expectations and get that buy-in creates a win-win scenario where now the customer is going to be happy, as opposed to, hey, the team's gone off in a corner and we don't know what we're going to get back when. Now there's some visibility into that, and your customer is more amenable to working with you when you have roadblocks, as well as the customer feels empowered that there's some structure and process for dealing with change. There might be a change in the marketplace. There might be a reprioritization of what's important to the customer as you're working toward their software deliverable. And it's frustrating to customer. The whole change management process I kind of alluded to before is frustrating for customers as well. Software is very fluid. Technology is very fluid nowadays in society. And as you're working, something that may have changed because a competitor did something, that the underpinning technology that you were assuming isn't going to happen on time, or perhaps was just the wrong choice. That change happens, is the point. It happens for the customer. It happens for the development team. And empowering both sides through working together is a powerful way to deal with that change. Okay. Executing the sprint itself. All right. So again, the team takes responsibility for the release of that sprint. They are accountable to the product owner. Once they make that promise after the sprint planning, they've basically said, we promise that we're going to deliver this. All right. There's accountability for a story. All right. The Scrum Master is accountable for the sprint. In other words, they're, again, responsible for enforcing the sprint rules. But the responsibility for individual stories is normally taken on by the team as a whole. And it's the Scrum Master's responsibility to ensure that stories are getting completed. Because an individual story, and again, we're going to talk about user stories next week, but an individual story is essentially the element of our backlog, and it represents a requirement, something the customer wants in the software. Developers are accountable to the team. They take responsibilities for tasks. So what's going to happen next week when we talk about user stories is the team will go through and plan out the set of tasks that need to be done to make that requirement a reality. And for any given user story, there should be multiple members of the team involved, not just a single member of the team involved, to make that to complete that story. And the developers have an accountability to the team as a whole to work through their tasks in a timely fashion and obey the rules of Scrum for doing so. I'll give you an example. On my class projects, I ask that developers be working students only be working on 2 tasks at a time at any given time. Here, with some of the machinery, it's a general practice in industry and Agile to try and keep the number of tasks of developers working on any given time as small as possible, really one, meaning when I look at the work that's laid out on our Scrum board, which we'll get to, that my name should only appear on one thing that's in progress, and I should work on that till completion. I'm not quite as dogmatic as that, but I want you to only be working on at most two things at a time that appear on the Scrum board. Minimize the number of developers working on a story, and again, that varies. I don't normally like sprints and stories where only one developer works on one requirement. It sacrifices your quality. It creates a communication gap and isolation, if you will. And it kind of reduces the visibility the entire team has into what's going on. And I think it's more enjoyable to do software development in a collaborative fashion anyway. So I like to see at least two developers working on the collection of tasks related to a particular story. Now, an important thing is that the team is responsible for changing tasks as they see fit. So at the end of the sprint planning session, you'll be asked to define what are the initial set of tasks you think it will take to get that done. Again, I need to write the user story is I want to produce a database migration script to go from version 7 to version 8. And initially, the set of tasks might be, okay, investigate the export to XML function here, transform some of the artifacts in the file system so that they move over here, maybe write a shell script, I don't know, and then turn around and write an import feature, making it up. But the point is, maybe when you got down to exporting things to XML, it wasn't important to finish that if you found out that was the wrong thing to do in the first place. Maybe you need to export it to a JSON format or some kind of binary format or something different. Maybe there's an additional step that came up that you didn't anticipate. Maybe there was a security mechanism you need to add on it or something. I don't know. But the point is when you get down to how you're going to do something to contribute to the shippable product increment, you are empowered to say, that's not the right thing to do. Today I'm going to do this. Or here's some additional stuff we forgot. All right. And again, I'll point these things out when we take a look at our Scrum board. And then the final thing is this. And this is a hard thing for developers. It's certainly a hard thing for students. When something is a task or a story is considered complete or done, done means done. It means it's 100% done. It doesn't mean it compiles. It doesn't mean I'm mostly done, I just got to work out this little part. You don't get to move it across the Scrum board. You don't get to put it in the done stack, the outgoing stack, if you will, if it's not 100% done. And 100% done also involves the quality practices like the ones we're going to talk about in this class. If there were unit tests to write, it includes the unit tests. If there was static analysis to run, you got to run it and react to it. If there was a code review that was decided should be done for that, perform the code review. You don't get to call it done until it's all the way done, including the developer level acceptance testing that you'll do on each one of your requirements. All right. Okay. And I kind of talked about this one already. This was the roles and responsibility of the stakeholders. Again, the people involved in this sprint planning process and then through to execution are business people, the product owners, the customers, and the development people, the pigs. They're responsible for committing to work. They're responsible for estimating work. They're responsible for understanding trade-offs between doing work and when things are done. Hey, if we do that work now, we're forced into an architectural decision we're not prepared to make. Or as long as you're doing this, we should do this too because this will be more effective in the long run. These kinds of things. Also, the development people, they get to decide again what specific tasks need to be done to actually meet the requirement. All right. And even in the context of when they're doing the sprint, and you have this set of stories, these items on the sprint backlog that the team has to deliver, they get to decide which ones to work first. All right. It's not that the product owner, the customer, even the Scrum Master comes in and says, hey, there's 5 user stories you're delivering as part of this sprint, but I want you to work on this one first. That gets to be decided by the development folks. So really how it works is the customer first, customer/product owner, is first going to define value. All right. Now, how do they define value? When we talk about user stories next week, we'll talk about a concept called story points. We'll talk about assigning story points or business value to each requirement. So that prioritization is going to be done by the customer in terms of how valuable would this feature or this thing be to the overall product. All right, and that's how it gets to the top of the release. And again, the customer can change those priorities at any time, but at the time you're going to sit down and do the sprint planning and finish this negotiation process, wherever the product backlog stands and the values have been assigned, that's where they stay for the purposes of sprint planning. Now, what happens with the developers, the programmers? Programmers get to look at the product backlog, at the values assigned to it, and they look at each one that's potentially included in the sprint and say, well, here's how much that's going to cost. Right? I'm going to tell you, Mr. Customer, you want that. Here's how much it's going to cost. You can't have, those 10 things together. You can only have 5 of them. Why? Because these 5 things, to do them together in terms of the size, capabilities of the team, the amount of time in the sprint, this is as much as we are willing or to commit to accept responsibility for. Then the customer is going to look at that and kind of go, okay, let me make some value decisions. All right, I define the value. All right, I define what was important to me, but now you put price tags on them. So I get to go back and say, this is the value I want to build. So at the end of the day, what goes into the sprint goal, what goes into the sprint backlog, the final say it's really supposed to be a collaborative decision, a partnering decision. But in effect, the customer gets a final say based on the estimates that the developers provided. So they get the final say, it's okay, you're saying I could have this or that, I'll decide on that. All right. And then the programmers go off and build it. This is sprint execution. All right. And when they're done, we go back, conduct another planning session. All right. So that's the kind of lather, rinse, repeat that goes on every sprint. And then that is turning the crank. That's what a sprint does. You turn the crank, you chew through so much work, you produce a product at the end, and as soon as you're done, you take a deep breath and you go and you do it again. Some more stuff in terms of executing a sprint. Let me remind you where we are. We are here in the mini how-to. We just talked about defining a goal, conducting a sprint, and now we're talking about executing a sprint. We talked about taking responsible for a story on the sprint backlog, so now we're at conducting daily stand-ups. What are daily stand-ups, or what's called the Scrum meeting? They can be attended by chickens and pigs, although each team member, meaning each pig, gets to answer 3 questions. First, they answer the question, since last Scrum, I did blah, blah, blah. And then the second question, before next Scrum, I will blah, blah, blah. And my impediments are. All right. The Scrum Master runs this. The Scrum Master documents the impediments. If an impediment or an obstacle that an individual raises is not immediately solvable, then the Scrum Master has to, after the meeting, help try and remove the impediment in some way. And if there's anything blocking a team that comes up, all right, in other words, if over a sequence of daily stand-ups every day, it's clear that the team is not making progress, that they have some kind of issue that they need a decision on, the Scrum Master will make a decision now. That a Scrum Master may have to go off and address that risk. They have to go find the product owner or the customer, or they have to work with operations to identify that server, whatever the impediment is. The Scrum Master, again, will first make the now decision in order to keep the team moving. All right. You don't want to walk out of a daily stand-up and have the Scrum Master say, how everybody wait a few minutes, let me try and resolve, and I'll get back to you later today, right? Because then everybody goes back to what they were doing and can't get anything done. They're blocked. All right. So the Scrum Master makes the now decision, keeps the team moving, and if that decision needs to be revisited in light of later, better information, then it will be. As simple as that. Here's a very, very, very important point to the Scrum meeting, the daily stand-up, and I am going to emphasize this. You will be graded on this, and that's this last bullet here. That's very important. when you as a developer, you as a pig, answer the three questions, they should be answered with respect to specific things in your sprint. Meaning they should reference a user story, they should reference a task, they could reference work items or commits in your configuration management tool, which we'll also be doing shortly in this class. But you have to point to something. You can't just say, well, since last Scrum I did some stuff, and since next Scrum I did some. I'll work on it some more. All right. And my impediment is I don't understand that thing very well. That doesn't cut it. That's not appropriate. You need to say, since last Scrum, I worked on task export to XML under user story. We need a database migration process. And, I got about halfway through it yesterday, right? So it doesn't have to be overly formal, but you have to reference specific work and say, give an idea how far you went through it, all right? And when you're done, you go, hey, and I finished the export to XML script, and you will see it under GitHub commit number, blah, 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 all right, under this dev branch. And again, those things will make more sense as we talk about those things specifically. But again, this nebulous, I kind of did some stuff, I'll do some more stuff. There's no utility, there's no information for the team when you're going to be so ambiguous about what you're working on and how much you got done. Okay. If you don't recognize the image, by the way, it's from Monty Python's The Holy Grail. If you have seen it, you know what scene I'm talking about. But there's the YouTube clip for it. I suggest pausing the video and taking a quick look at that one, because every time I hear an Agile about, answer me these questions 3, I immediately go to that scene. But Agile Scrum has its own notion of the 3 questions. Okay. So, painting a picture, let's take a second and go back to our parent Scrum diagram all the way back here. And so we talked about the backlog, choosing work, negotiating over what goes on the sprint backlog. Everybody's happy. You go and you do that work in the context of a sprint. Every day you're going to start it with a 15-minute, could be 5-minute daily meeting, answering the 3 questions. To keep that outer loop keeps that inner loop churning. You do it every single day to produce this. All right. Well, great. Now, how do you have some visibility into what the heck's going on? Where what are these tasks that you're doing since the last Scrum meeting and before the next one? Who's tracking that? Do we have to go back to a Gantt chart or a project, a Microsoft project? Well, we didn't want to use those things, right? We wanted to be more empirically and feedback oriented, make those small Mario Kart adjustments. What's become popular, and one of the reasons to me that Scrum really has become the most popular Agile methodology, one of the most powerful tools is something called a Scrum board. And we will use Scrum boards, so I want to take a few minutes and talk about this. And I did also, by the way, I think I posted, you can Google up the concept of an information radiator. Coburn talks about it on his blog. Other folks talk about it. And again, in a co-located team, you would see physical Scrum boards like this. This is a really good one. You see the green dividers here. You see these headers along the top. You see all the sticky notes going across. What do these things represent? They represent the sprint backlog, the set of things that the team has committed to. And it can be it can be this way as well. But basically, those requirements are supposed to go into the potentially shippable increment you produce at the end of the sprint. So it has the stories, and it also has the tasks. So the team creates tasks, right? And the team controls the tasks. The pigs control the tasks. So they sit down at the end of the sprint planning session and start, what are my initial set of tasks? And they do that by writing different color stickies normally. And you even see little adornments if you look carefully. Magnets some teams use a bit smaller stickies. And that represents who these things are assigned to. And normally you go through a set of states. In other words, you start with a task and you say, we're going to need to do this stuff. And the task sits in a queue of work, but it's unassigned at that point. The team starts assigning things that they're going to work on. Remember, I talked about for you guys at most 2 at a time, and in a lot of places like only 1. You basically grab a task card, you grab a sticky note, you put it under in progress, and you put your name on it and say, now it's in progress because I'm accepting responsibility for doing this task. All right, and there could be several tasks that are being done according to that one row. Let me clear out the ink again. And again, I know these. You can see lots of pictures of Scrum boards on your Google Images, if you will. But let me parse the anatomy even a little bit better for you. When you look at this, what you see across the top normally is the set of states that a user story and task can go through. All right, and again, those states are things like, hey, this needs to be done. It's unassigned. No one's picked it up in the team yet. Or, hey, the next one, it's in process. Somebody came along and said, hey, this is something I'll take responsibility for starting, I'll do. That's something a pig does. Okay, they worked through it, and normally I like a stage or a state where something's in verify or to test. In other words, the pig finished it, but now it needs to be tested in some regard. And normally you try and get somebody else to test it. If you get the Scrum Master, the product owner, even to look at it, great. But at least maybe another developer. Hey, I finished this. Can you take a look? Do you agree that this was good for the task? Completes the task. What happens is over time, all these, let's say these blue things are normally piled on the left, and they are user stories, are requirements. Again, we'll talk about them. And the white things are tasks. They're items of work to be done, things you actually do. These are verbs, these are nouns. Okay. What happens over time from the beginning of the sprint to the end is, at the beginning of the sprint, you start off with a whole bunch of work you think you need to do on the left. And as you start to do it, you start pushing it over to the right. So the whole flow of the board goes this way, all right, from left to right. And as you get the task done, and you get all the tasks done in a row, this one doesn't quite have it, but if you got all the tasks done in a row, then you wind up being all the way done with that user story, so you hope. In fact, I can't really see the headers on this one, but I would suspect what's really happening is that this work is moving from here to here to here, and the point is everything's got to push this way, so eventually you can drag the user story and call it done all the way over on that side. Now these are physical Scrum boards, and they're called information radiators because they're supposed to be on big boards in development shops. And so you actually see, I promise you, the notion of a bullpen. We're talking the Kool-Aid talk. This is kind of a mini bullpen here. You can see open tables. The Scrum board is fully visible. It's radiating information for the team sitting right next to it. And when a developer's done, they stand up, they move over here, and they move their tasks along. And tasks, by the way, should be scoped to only be kind of defined in hours long kind of format. In other words, as a developer, you should be able to move a few different tasks through these states per day. Certainly several per week. So it's very dynamic. From if you take a snapshot every day of what the board looks like, it should increasingly look heavier on the right if you're maintaining your velocity. Okay. That's a physical one in an office. If you work in a co-located team, all sitting around these tables in this kind of bullpen format. But if you're a virtual team, like you are going to be online, then you need a virtual tool. You need a web-based tool. A lot of web-based tools out there. Here's an example of one. So here's an example of and this one's I know a little bit more readable. This is an actual project of mine. Research project, and let me explain what this Scrum board represents. First, backlog item. These are the items on the sprint backlog. All right, these things that exist in this column, then, these things are called user stories. All right, the user stories in blue, namely these first two, are not done. All right, so the tool color codes the ones that are not done. How do we know they're not done? Well, they still have work associated with them. All right, The work for bug fixes, and here we just have a user story representing the amount of work we need to do for bug fixes, has 5 different ones under the to-do column. Now you can even see that one of them has been assigned, but it really shouldn't be. All right, work that's in the to-do shouldn't really be assigned. If it's assigned, then it should go here. Like this one is assigned. It's assigned to someone, and it's in progress. Okay, when that work is done, like over here, then the developer, the pig, moves it to test, and you would hope that a different developer or a scrum master or a product owner or a stakeholder, someone else, will look and say, okay, I can verify that you did that and you did it correctly. All right. And then when you move all of your tasks all the way over to the right, like this one did, and this one only had one task, all right, when you move them all the way over to the right, that implies that the user story is done, which is why in this particular tool called ScrumWise, these are green. All right, green means that the user story is done as well. This particular tool doesn't actually physically move the user story over to the right, but when the tasks are all done, it's going to say, hey, the user story is done, right? If the user story isn't done, then it implies that there's some more work to do, and that you actually should have somewhere in one of these areas some work going on. But all our work's over here, so both of these are done. All right. So the goal over time is to keep moving more and more stuff, all right, over into the done column. And when it's all done, you should meet the sprint goal, and all these should be done as well. All these being the user stories should be done as well. They should all be green. Okay. Whether you do this with sticky notes and masking tape on a wall, or you do it in a virtual tool, the principle's the same. I used to use ScrumWise in the courses. You're actually going to use a tool called Taiga, but it's going to be the same concept. You'll see the same set of columns. You'll see this notion of backlog items that you drag in, and you'll see that you can move things to the right, if you will, and burn through the work over the course of a sprint. Okay. The steering part. Oh, there's Super Mario. He's back, right? Again, the important part, one of the key parts of any agile methodology, and certainly Scrum as well, is this concept of embracing change. All right. So we talked about it before. Executing a sprint has been compared to driving a wobbly vehicle on a slick road. You always want to be going directionally. You want to be head directionally towards your sprint goal. All right, and that sprint goal should align with the roadmap for your product. But you're always going to make constant adjustments just to get there. All right, those constant adjustments are done by making sure that you have near continuous feedback. In Scrum, then, the daily stand-up mechanism and the Scrum board is what gives you the constant data or feedback to react and embrace change. Those are not the full set, but the main mechanisms by which you embrace change, by which you deal with it. The first thing is just to becoming aware, right? Getting that feedback that something's going on that has to be addressed. So all the way back to here, all right, this daily stand-up meeting combined with the Scrum boards like this or Scrum boards like that are supposed to give everybody, I mean, you can go to this Scrum board at any time and find out what's going on. You can even find out who the heck is online with you. All right, if another team name's there. So even if you're a distributed team, normally you're on this tool all day long and continuing to work through it, just like you did if you're sitting around a common bullpen. That is how you react. That's how you notice when something comes up. Normally, by the way, if you're working in a distributed virtual environment and you need an online Scrum board, then normally you also have a constant way of communication, a constant video room or hangout, or a constant chat session. Or some folks use IRC, Internet Relay Chat, all kinds of different chat mechanisms out there. But just because you may not have a bullpen where you're all sitting together online, you may virtually do that. We had a presentation here in Phoenix from State Farm. State Farm opened a development facility for their IT group out here, hundreds going on thousands of people, and they have 360-degree cameras on their desks and big screen monitors so that they can at any time see who's working in Bloomington, Illinois, and get on an interaction with them just as if they were sitting around a table. These kinds of things are becoming quite popular to enable that distributed development we talked about. Right? Teams are fully part of the steering is teams again fully empowered to change the task. So the teams can go anything that you see in here in the task area, the team can change anything. Team owns these tasks all the way in here. All right. The team doesn't own this area. This represents the agreement. And you know what? I'm going to clear this off again so we can see it a little better. All right. So team owns tasks. Team can decide that a task is not worthwhile and delete it, and decide to do something else and add a new task at any time. But the team can't change this, the agreement of what work was supposed to be done. The team can't change the timeline for the sprint dynamically. They can't say, well, we're not going to get all those done in the 2-week sprint, so we're going to move the sprint back a week. These are fixed time box iterations. They don't get to do that either. All right, they get to only own this part, if you will. So you can't change that stories. You can't change the overall sprint goal, which again, the sprint goal is kind of the union of these stories and that declarative statement that represents what the product would look like. Developers can't unilaterally do that. Now, what happens though if the team feels like it's in some trouble? That in the course of the sprint, they don't feel like they're actually going to be able to meet the potentially shippable increment. There's something going on. There's a couple things that you can do, and a couple things are allowed. And there's also a couple mechanisms in all this that try and make this so it's not so damaging. First is this is a reason to keep sprints really short, right? If you encounter something that kind of really throws, now our wobbly vehicle on the road fell off the road. I mean, whatever has happened, whatever we've discovered, whatever has changed, is simply too much of a change to recover. What do we do? One is a reminder that the entire team owns and is responsible for delivering the product. All right. So when an issue comes up, and an issue that basically impedes the team from making any progress, that's called a blocker. The team will focus its collective energy. Well, what does that mean? Well, in agile terms, that's called a spike. A spike is, when you look at this and you look at your entire team and the work flowing across it, a lot of moving parts, a couple people working on a couple different stories at a time. I might be working with one person on this story here, but working with a different on this story here or whatnot, and everyone's just trying to manage that complexity of shared work by using these tools. But what happens when things on this board just stop? They stop flowing to the right. All right, and we can't make any progress. What happens is you kind of put the board on pause and you do a spike, which means the entire team says we're going to focus on removing this blocker issue to get us restarted. The car's stalled. We can't, as a team, do anything until we restart it. So that's called a spike. All right. The team does whatever they need to do. They may need to do a deep dive into a designer technology question with everybody in order to get information. Hey, we just had a security problem come up. It's particularly nasty. Maybe there's a new virus. Who knows? There's a new hack out there. We need to address it. We're going to stop the world. We're going to stop the team. We're going to stop the Scrum board, and everybody's going to go off and do some research and investigation, some tasks dynamically around it in order to try and get over this quickly and kind of re-ramp up the velocity in our sprint. Right? You spike in part because you can't get the decision wrong and because you need to get the team going again. That side work normally doesn't have any business value associated, so we create what's called a zero value story for it. I'll talk more about those when we talk about user stories next week. All right. So that's one. One is when there's just something that comes up that's really hard and requires the team's full intellectual energy, if you will. Um, the second one, again, is kind of the situation where an obstacle interrupts the team's velocity. And again, that team's velocity is that notion of velocity means speed, the speed and rhythm at which the team works. All right, and we need the spike to reestablish and to get back into that rhythm. Basically, we got to put Super Mario back on the road and get things reset for the team. Spikes are supposed to be relatively short. Normally, in teams I worked on, they're meant to be really measured in terms of hours, not days even, because your whole sprint is supposed to be short. So it might be the team taking the afternoon and, working together around a bullpen, taking over a conference room, doing what they need to do to move through the blocker. Now, if the blocker goes on 4 days, then you might have to consider more drastic options. Technically, if you decide that the sprint is or has already failed, that even though maybe you're 1 week into a 2 week sprint, but the blocker is so significant that you're not going to be able to meet your obligations, you're still obligated to fail fast. So you're obligated to say, we're going to stop the sprint, we're going to replan, we're going to get back on track by basically setting up a whole new sprint and doing a reset. But of course, at that point, you got to bring in your stakeholders, you've got to bring in your product owner slash customer, and kind of go through that process again. It's painful to admit failure. The only thing I can say is admitting failure after 2 weeks is worse than admitting failure after 1 week. If you know something's going to fail at the moment you fail, you know you're going to fail, you fail fast. So you don't waste time in order to take the steps required to get through something. I saw this as an aside. When I worked in the industry, I had a lot of junior developers on my team, and one of the hardest things to get them to do was to admit defeat on something, that they weren't going to be successful being able to do something for the team in the context of some iteration. They viewed it almost like getting a bad grade in a class. They didn't want to admit failure. But really, no one enjoys failure, but you really limit the ability for other people to help you when something is going to fail and you don't share that knowledge. You know it's going to fail and you don't tell anybody, whether you're an individual, whether you're a team, because you're not allowing your other stakeholders any means by which they can recover from that. All right. You're going to talk a lot about that when you take 416 with some project management, when you talk about the nature of risks, for example. But realize in its own way, it exists in any project you do, and it exists in Agile in this way. All right. So failed sprints should be stopped and should be replanned. But first, if there's some collective energy to push the team over that hump and get back on track, that collective energy is called a spike. You do that, you try and get over the hump and get everything reset again. Okay. The sprint review. So now we've planned the sprint, we've executed the sprint, and we're at the end of the sprint. What kind of things go on? First, the sprint review. When a sprint completes, the sprint team gives a demo of working software to the product owner. You made a commitment to deliver working software. You've got to demo that for your product owner, the person that you negotiated with back at the beginning of the sprint and the sprint planning. It's not something that is intended for you to do some huge amount of preparation. And it's not a formal presentation either. It's not a PowerPoint presentation. It's a functioning demo, so you shouldn't require a lot of prep to do it. All right, you should be able to just build what you got and walk the product owner through it, and it should be such a direct connection to what you agreed upon that you don't need all this preparation to try and explain to the customer, hey, you remember when we talked about this? Well, this is what it means over here. That translation shouldn't have to happen, all right, because you had this conversation about what was supposed to be just a short time ago. Any stakeholders, so any chicken is allowed to attend. All right, so everyone interested in the results in seeing the sprint is attend. I know in a particular company here in town, Infusion Software, they would pretty much have the whole company come to these things, just about, or anyone in the company was welcome to do them. When you conduct them, the review, a shared decision between you being the pigs and the product owner, A shared decision or agreement is made as to whether or not the sprint goal has been met. So you put the sprint goal right up there and say, here's what we said we wanted to accomplish, and you give an honest answer whether or not you accomplished it or not. And again, just like a lot of things that you get a feel for here, the purpose is to get feedback. All right. The observations and comments that you collect from anybody turn into modifications of things in the product backlog, reprioritization of things in the backlog, or perhaps new items on the product backlog. All right. So that's the sprint review. And then there's also the retrospective. Um, as and we will talk more about retrospectives. Retrospectives are the Scrum variant. Sprint retrospectives are the Scrum variant of postmortems. Postmortems or project reviews have been an accepted software engineering process practice for a long time. Typically conducted at the end of products, normally contributes to a culture of continuous process improvement in the entire development organization. And oh yeah, by the way, if there were some pain points in the project, it gives people an emotional release for that as well. Um, the sprint retrospectives in context of Scrum are not as comprehensive. They're not as broad in scope as a full project review. Even though at the end of a release in Scrum, a formal release externally to customers, not a shippable increment. Excuse me. You can still do a full-blown postmortem. But at the end of a sprint, as it was a short time period, the development team, the pigs, the pigs and the customer, um, um, will conduct a sprint retrospective. It's a little bit more about what's going on in the here and now, what happened in the last sprint, and how you might do things a little bit better. Hey, when our Scrum board got a little messy this past sprint, I really couldn't understand it. Or, hey, in the last sprint, we kind of didn't obey our rule of only working on one task at a time, and we had too many going on there. Oh, hey, last sprint, we didn't do a good job of updating our estimates. All these kinds of things. We didn't do a good job of testing. Whatever the team being honest about itself. Like any retrospective activity at an iteration or project level, you try and be as data driven as possible. There's always in a what's a social exercise like this. So a sprint retrospective, the team normally gets in a room together and goes through what they think happened. There's always a little human nature to vent a little bit. If you're familiar with Seinfeld, it's the Festivus airing of the grievances, if you will. Folks kind of natural to complain a little bit, but it isn't just a complaint session. It's meant so you can do those minor adjustments as you go into the next sprint to make the next sprint better and not repeat minor mistakes that you've just been doing. And if you can do that by being data driven, then as an organization you can contribute to better agile processes over time. The kinds of things are normally very small. The recommendations, like I was saying, and kind of common sense. And normally most folks agree on them pretty readily. I've rarely gone to a sprint retrospective that's gotten too contentious about things. And it's not meant to. By the way, the sprint retrospective is not the place to propose a whole new way of doing things for the entire company, if you will. It's about the project you're working on, the product you're working on, the team you're working in. Observations that are collected from sprint retrospectives and release retrospectives over time in an organization can contribute to the overall organization's continuous process improvement, which is why the Scrum Master should really be facilitating trying to collect some quantitative data and some qualitative measures that are a bit more objective interpretation than emotional interpretation, if you will, so that you can conduct that continuous process activity outside of the current project. Okay, that's it for this. So again, real quick review on the how-to, just because I ran through that for the last 45 minutes or so. And you're going to do all these things. That's why I'm reiterating them. First, you're going to sit down on your team and define your sprint goal. What are you going to get done in the next 2 weeks? What's the product going to look like? You're going to conduct that planning session. You're going to have things in the context of user stories and tasks. You're going to set up your Scrum board for the sprint. You're going to see that the Scrum board agrees with the sprint goal. If you need to revise the sprint goal some, you will. This you will do. This will be a short conversation. This will take a little bit longer, and then you go about your daily business of executing the sprint. You will not conduct. You will take responsibilities for stories and tasks off the backlog. So you will go to the Scrum board and assign tasks to yourself. You will conduct daily stand-ups, not daily. I do ask that student teams talk to each other briefly 3 times a week. We'll talk more about that at project kickoff. You will use the Scrum board. You will use something called a burn down on it, which we'll talk about in Sprint 2. You'll use continuous integration and testing dashboards. We'll talk about that later in the semester. You'll initially just start with the Scrum board and your source code control, but you'll be monitoring these tools yourselves to see how your progress is going. And you'll determine as a team when you need to spike. If you need to spike, you'll also determine when you need to change a task on the Scrum board, because you're empowered to do so. You'll deliver working software and conduct a sprint review. I will ask you to video a demo at the end of every sprint, so plan on doing that 3 times. And then after the first 2 sprints at least, I'm going to ask you to conduct a reflection activity, a retrospective, asking pretty much how the team is doing. All right. So that's a summary of kind of the machinery of Scrum. That's how it's relevant in the context of your projects. That doesn't give you enough information to certainly start today working in the context of a project team, but we will be we'll be forming project teams this week. We'll be kicking off a project next week. I'll set up all the scaffolding for you of when your sprints are, what the actual project is. We'll talk about how to set up your Scrum board, and then you'll go through and do it. And this is how we'll conduct your projects over the next 2 months. All right. Periodically in the course, almost every week, certainly every 2 weeks, there'll be an Agile activity or an Agile topic that we'll talk about. So again, next week we'll kick off the Agile project. The week after that we'll talk about burn down charts. The week after that we'll conclude a sprint, conduct a retrospective, plan the next one. Week after that we'll do continuous integration and test, and so forth. So in addition to the software quality construction practices that we're doing throughout the course, you will be conducting these sprints and learning a little bit more about Agile every week under the context of this structure. All right. Okay, that concludes this video. That's a lot of material, and we will move forward into specific Agile techniques next time.